The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-3 was a single-engine Soviet fighter. It was based on the unsuccessful MiG-1, of which only roughly 100 were produced, and was designed as a high-altitude interceptor with three main goals: a range of more than 1,000 kilometers, a service ceiling above 12,000 meters, and a speed above 600 kilometers per hour. After development, range was found to be lower than the 1,000 kilometers required. Alexander Filin, head of the Air Force Scientific Test Institute, was responsible for the findings. This was a source of controversy as Artyom Mikoyan, one of the aircraft's designers, disagreed. He made two dubious test flights from Moscow to Leningrad to prove that the aircraft's range was indeed above that mark. This event, and poor production quality of the first MiG-3 models, would lead to the summary execution of Alexander Filin on charges of anti-Soviet conspiracy. Improvements upon the MiG-1 included an increase in stability, aerodynamic engine intakes, increased fuel capacity, and an increase in armor protecting the pilot, at the cost of an increase in weight. To keep the weight as low as possible, the MiG-3 kept the predecessor's armament of one 12.7 mm and a pair of 7.62 mm machine guns all mounted in the nose. This was considered inadequate armament even for 1940 standards. The first flight was in October 1940, and, despite all the known issues, the need for a modern fighter was more pressing, and MiG-3 production started in February 1941. By June 1941, the Soviet Air Force, or VVS, had more than 1,000 MiG-3s, but less than 500 trained pilots on the model. This would become the major problem regarding the MiG-3, as it was quite an unforgiving aircraft, demanding a high level of piloting skill. One particular event was revealing of this. In April 1941, before the German invasion, three MiG-3s scrambled to intercept a German reconnaissance aircraft flying at about 30,000 feet. All three aircraft were lost after entering into irrecoverable spins, one of the pilots losing his life. An investigation found that the pilots were inexperienced on the MiG-3 and were flying for the first time at high altitude. With the German invasion, the outlook on the MiG-3 became even darker. Despite occasional successes, most MiG-3s were destroyed in the opening days of the invasion, mostly on the ground, where they were parked in a parade-style configuration without camouflage or adequate anti-air cover. When facing German Messerschmitt fighters, the Soviet fighter was found wanting and was outclassed in most aspects, with the notable exception of high-altitude engagements, which were rare on the Eastern Front. With more successful fighters on the front lines, like the Yak-1 and Lag-3, production was terminated in December 1941, and the last few were assembled in April 1942. After a failed attempt to use it as a ground attack aircraft, the MiG-3 was pulled away from the front lines and started being used in a city defense role, where it met more success, fighting until the end of the war. As an example, during 1942, MiG-3s from the 15th Regiment of the 6th Fighter Aviation Corps of the PVO shot down 72 German aircraft while defending Moscow. Despite sporadic successes, the MiG-3 was the holder of a very negative record, as 1,432 of all 3,422 produced were lost in combat of any kind. This is commonly stated as the worst ratio among all Soviet fighters. Still, some pilots were able to successfully fly the aircraft. A few even reached acedom and became passionate advocates of the MiG-3's qualities, as we will see further ahead. The MiG-3 was faster than most of its rivals at high altitudes, but closer to the sea level this advantage disappeared. The MiG-3 was powered by a supercharged Mikulin AM-35A that could produce a very decent 1,350 horsepower. The similarities of this engine with the AM-38 used on the Il-62 Shturmovik dictated that production was switched in preference of the more successful aircraft, expediting the MiG-3's end. When used from a higher altitude on a dive against its enemies, the MiG-3 was at its best, being able to keep a good level of energy and climbing back to altitude. The armament was inadequate and struggled even against light bombers. It was also prone to malfunctions and had very deficient gun sights that forced pilots to shoot at point-blank range. The MiG-3 demanded a higher-than-average pilot skill, resulting in a high number of losses due to accidents. The Soviet fighter was sluggish, and even more so at low altitudes. It was outturned by most enemy fighters. especially by its main opponent, the Bf-109. The MiG-3 only had a few changes. We will look at 3 of them. The MiG-7 was a MiG-3 with the AM-37 engine, and only the prototype was made. The I-210 was a failed attempt to use a radial engine on the MiG-3 that would have been called MiG-9 if it had been produced. This was the original version. It had a Mikoyan AM-35A engine that could develop 1350 horsepower. It had one 12.7mm Berezin UBS machine gun and two 7.62mm SH-KAS machine guns in the engine hull. It could take up to 220 kg of bombs or 6 RS-82 rockets. Almost 2,000 of this model were produced. MiG-315BK. After the MiG-3's armament was found to be inadequate, the main version was added two 12.7mm Berezin UBK wing-mounted machine guns. The extra weight and drag impaired the aircraft's performance, and pilots were known to remove them. 821 were produced. MiG-334, variant armed with two 20mm SH-VAK nose-mounted cannons for more effectiveness against bombers. Only 52 were produced. We will now compare the MiG-3 to its main foe, the Messerschmitt Bf-109F2. The reference time is the start of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Messerschmitt was much more maneuverable than the MiG-3. The MiG-3 had a much more powerful engine, which was in part necessary due to its heavier weight. The Soviet aircraft was faster at higher altitudes, but that advantage disappeared at lower altitudes. As most fighting in the Eastern Front was at mid to low altitudes, the Soviet plane's advantage was mostly inconsequential. Despite Artyom Mikoyan defending the aircraft had more than 1,000 kilometers of range, 820 is the more accepted number. This was still in excess of what the Bf-109 could do. The MiG-3 also had a small advantage here. The German plane had a much superior climb performance, helped by being more than 600 kg lighter than the Soviet. The Messerschmitt's armament was slightly better than the MiG-3's. This was aggravated by the defective sights and the instability at high speeds, making the German plane much more lethal. The German fighter proved to be superior to the MiG-3, and that was one of the reasons that brought the MiG's production to a halt. Still, as it can be seen, the Soviet plane had its own bright spots, especially at high altitudes. Alexander Ivanovich Pokrishkin was a Soviet fighter pilot during the Second World War. His operational debut was flying the MiG-3 while still a lieutenant in May 1941. Pokrishkin's first victory came on the 23rd of June of the same year, one day after Germany's invasion, but it was probably the one he regretted the most, as he shot down a Soviet Sukhoi Su-2 light bomber. That aircraft's design had been kept secret by Soviet authorities, and Pokrishkin believed it to be a foe. The next day, the Soviet pilot actually achieved his first victory, shooting down a German Bf-109E. He attained 12 victories flying the MiG-3, and is considered to have shot down 53 aircraft during the war, making him the third highest scoring pilot of the Soviet Union. Pokrishkin was probably the most enthusiastic defender of the Soviet fighter. The MiG-3 fighter demanded new skills and additional effort from pilots. It was like a stallion. With a skillful rider it ran like the wind, but if we lost control we could end beneath its hooves. His diving tactics with the MiG-3 were highly successful, and he was a proponent of changing the combat techniques being used by the Soviet Union. Initially, Soviet leadership was resistant to the changes he advocated, but later his notes were used to modify the Soviet fighter's combat manual. Pokrishkin also flew the Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter, which he despised, and remarked that it must have been designed by myopic carpenters. Later, he flew the American Bell P-39 Era Cobra, which was much more to his liking. He achieved most of his victories flying the American fighter. He was the first person to be awarded 3 times the Hero of the Soviet Union title, the highest distinction in the Soviet Union. He reached the rank of Marshal of Aviation. The MiG-3 was a controversial fighter. It had several issues that made it underperform. Greatest of all, its complexity and forgiving flying characteristics. Nevertheless, Pokrishkin, among others, proved that it could be used successfully in the hands of a good pilot. In addition, if the fighting in the Eastern Front had happened to be at higher altitudes, possibly the MiG-3 would have had a better performance. It was designed before Germany's invasion, and it performed a role that no other Soviet fighter could, that of a high-altitude interceptor. The MiG-3 was also present at the Soviet Union's darkest hour, a time where the Soviet Air Force was shattered, making it certainly underperform due to the disorganization and lack of experienced pilots. The experience gathered by the Mikoyan-Gurevich designers would later prove invaluable in creating a dynasty of fighters that still lives to this day, some of them highly successful. Was it the wrong aircraft at the wrong time, or was Pokrishkin correct in blaming the lack of adequate pilot training? Let me know what you think of this controversial aircraft in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.